In Throne of Liberty, it is super important to have the right stats in order to output as much damage as possible. Nearly every stat has significant diminishing returns, and so there's a kind of soft cap that you need to be aware of in order to min-max your damage output. You should also be aware that regular PvE enemies actually have defense stats. I don't know about you guys, but I've been getting a ton of field boss drops over the past few weeks that Talandre has come out. You can't really argue it's just luck with the amount of contribution I'm getting. And you can totally do this too, as long as you're focusing on the right items for your build. Ultimately, I have this damage formula where you can easily find how much damage you should be doing and then how much would be a bit of an increase to one certain stat, so you can find out how effective that is versus, say, increasing a different stat. For example, we went a bit more skill damage boost versus a bit more critical hit chance, and you can see the overall gain is in favor of the gain to the skill damage boost. So in this video, I will talk you through exactly how to use this calculator, how you can verify exactly in-game based on the numbers you see when you attack your target, as I have made such calculators in the past, but it was a bit more crude, and you couldn't so easily verify in-game. So the first thing you're going to want to do is either make a copy of this file or download it so you can ultimately edit. The only place you're going to edit this is within these white boxes. Everything else leave up to the calculator. And so you're going to have to input these numbers. We'll start with everything blank and show you a good example in game. Say we want to figure out what's my maximum damage with focused fire bombs, and then to figure out how I can improve that by improving certain stats. Well, you need to look first of all at the skill. Focused fire bombs has 510% of base damage. You need to plug that right in here, 510%, and then you need to add the 516. This simply going in the next slot. You may have other effects of this skill, for example gaining a boost of 120% against monsters, but we'll add that later. Now let's look at the actual stats we have on our character. So our minimum weapon base damage is going to be listed right here. Keep in mind, make sure to get the stats of the weapon that you're actually using to cast the skill. Even if I'm holding daggers right now and I cast my fire bombs, it's going to use my staff to cast that. So it's going to use my stats from my staff. So we see the minimum 258. We add that right here, and the maximum 613 added right in here. Then we need to look at our critical hit chance. So here 1260. We need to look at magical hit chance because we are using a magical weapon. Add that value right there. We do the same for then our heavy attack, which is 217, inputting it just there. Keep in mind, if you do have boss heavy attack, this is going to have to be added on top of your total heavy attack. Again, you're going to have to match the type. So for the staff, it's magic, and you will simply add that on top of this. And this will ultimately allow you to find your average amount of damage. However, in this case, we are fighting these dummies. They're not considered bosses, so we won't add that onto it. But now we go to skill damage boost. That's 529. Simply input that. And keep in mind, you're sometimes going to have different abilities that are like buffs, enchanting time as an example. This will simply add on to this value. You'll see it as well when you cast the ability that your stat will change. But then we look at monster damage boost. You may be wondering what this is. Well, some skills have an extra bonus versus monsters. So if we're looking to calculate this damage versus a monster like this practice dummy, which is considered as such, we simply add 120% to the table here. Then for damage buff, some skills are going to have a specific damage boost, like fire bombs. It's going to have an additional 120% if you max charge it. It's a multiplicative boost, so you simply add that here. You will need to be careful on certain abilities, whether they're additive or multiplicative. A lot of the times, if it's from two different sources, it will be multiplicative. But be aware with damage over time effects like adding to burning damage, they're usually additive. This Sacred Repose set can give up to 24% damage over time, and that's simply going to add on top of other burning damage over time bonuses, like this Mastery here, another damage over time bonus here. You will add them all together and put them as a damage buff in only one table. You won't put it, like I say, down here. We skip the second damage buff. You could have 3, 4, 5, 6 more damage buffs. Some abilities have that and they end up as multiplicative, but Firebombs only has the one monster one and then the other 120% one based on the charge time. So we then have bonus damage, very simply listed on our character sheet here again, 40, input that. Then we have critical damage, also just displayed here, 38.5%, input that. And now we have species damage boost. Be aware, dummies are not considered any of the species, and so you will not include that. This species damage boost, you will simply add the value here when fighting that particular enemy type. You will see this little icon next to any enemy. You will also see it when you're inspecting the boss. You look here, Haylock, it says it's a construct, Guardian says it's a demon, and so when fighting those enemy types, you will simply add this into the formula there. Now you also have the bonus damage, and this is just extra bonus damage against that enemy type, and you will simply add that to your flat bonus damage. So if I was fighting a construct here, I would have 7 plus 40, so I would simply input 47 into the formula. Then we have target's defense, and now against a dummy they have 0 defense, so that's fine. But if you're going into, say, a dungeon or fighting some enemies out in the open world, it's going to depend on the level of those enemies. If we're fighting a level 50 monster, they have about 1058 defense in my calculator. You can see the other defense values here as per the levels. However, again, our target does not have defense. We don't have to input this, and it shows we should be getting a maximum hit of 32,903 on our firebombs. So before we take it a step further to check this, make sure to double check all these stats are correct as per what you see in game in your character sheet. So we will use our camouflage cloak, we will charge up our firebombs, attack, and we got 32,953. This is slightly off from what you see in the calculator. And this is because this is a heavy attack, and heavy attacks get the bonus damage divided across the 2 hits. So we actually have 20 less on the hit we see, but because it's times 2, we're still benefiting from the total of our 40 bonus damage. So this value is then indeed correct. We can do the test again. Charge up our firebombs, hit 32,973, which is indeed what we see in the calculator, except say 1 point. That's due to rounding of numbers. So now we can look at this. Say we have a second build. If it has the same stats, we expect to deal the same damage. But if I say change up my stat points, rather than inputting everything into strength, I can go and put all these points into dex instead. And what happens is my base damage changes. We now have 629 maximum damage. We also have only 235 minimum damage. Our crit chance has also changed slightly. So we can go through all these values, update them for this second build. Again, double check everything here. Our crit damage has also gone up, and we can see that we should now hit for 35,653. This again being on a crit, so we can enter the camouflage cloak, do the firebombs, 35,632. Again, it was a heavy, so it's 20 less. It's half of our bonus damage on each hit. So that's correct. This ends up being an average of 6.7% damage gain versus one build to the other. And all I did was simply switch some ability points. And that's what you can do as well throughout every single bit of your build based on the different stats you're using. Finding out what build is then best to maximize that damage output. You can then, again, verify in-game the exact damage outputs you're doing. You don't necessarily need the camouflage cloak. I can cast my firebombs without casting it. And if I get a crit, I will still see that maximum damage. It's just easier to have the camouflage cloak and then always get that crit rather than casting it a few times. Because if my critical hit chance is 1355, my critical hit chance is 57.54%. So I still have over 42% of the time that I won't critically hit with my firebombs. So it might take a few casts. We try again. This was 35,000. That was a crit. But if we say get lower, we get 20,000. That could just be a non-crit. Anytime that you do not get a crit, it's going to roll randomly between your min and your max. This is accounted for within the calculator. Getting your minimum base damage modifier, your maximum base damage modifier, and then your damage if it was a crit, because your damage when it critically hits is boosted by the critical damage. It does not when it does not critically hit. You get the average then, and you ultimately end up with this table, and yes, the average total damage, the min and the max. You can read all of these little descriptions here, and I should show you exactly which values you need to be inputting. But just be aware, if your enemy has defenses, there's a bunch of counter stats here. For example, your critical hit chance. This is going to be countered by your enemy's endurance, and you're simply just going to get the difference. If my enemy has 500 endurance, I simply will take my critical hit chance and minus 500 from that. It works the same with skill damage boost. If my enemy has skill damage resistance, I'm simply going to reduce my skill damage boost to compensate for that. Keep in mind, however, if my enemy has, say, 0 skill damage resistance, and if I go and reduce their skill damage resistance, I'm still going to gain a damage boost equivalent to as if I gained skill damage boost. For example, if you test with time for punishment, reducing your target's skill damage resistance, you will see the exact same damage value as if you simply increased your skill damage boost by 220. So it's always best to go with, yes, reducing the skill damage resistance, because it's always going to boost your damage, but also everybody else's. However, you can go and take the personal one, because you can take advantage of the mastery right here, corrupting hit, to trigger that time for punishment just with your auto attacks. And then with heavy attack, that also has a counter attack, which is just heavy attack evasion. You simply minus it. If my enemy has 200 heavy attack evasion, then I simply reduce my heavy attack chance by that value. Same with evasion and hit chance. If my enemy has more evasion than my hit chance, I'm simply going to minus my hit chance from their evasion, and what's remaining will be the chance that my attack misses. Species damage boost does not have a counter stat. And then you look at other damage boosts like monster damage, no counter stat, damage buffs, no counter stat, critical hit damage, that does have a counter stat, which is critical hit damage reduction. Now, the way the formula works with all of these stats is super simple. There's basically only two. You have this one with the diminishing returns. So this is for skill damage boost, critical hit chance, heavy attack chance, miss chance, and your species damage boost. The more you have, the less effective it is. And it's exactly by this. If I have 500, you can see on this chart, it's going to be a 33.33% gain. This is either damage gain here, chance to critically hit, chance to heavy attack, chance to miss, extra damage against certain species. When you get to say 2,000, that's only going to be a 66.66%. So significantly less versus going from 0 to 1,000 than it is from 1,000 to 2,000. At 1,000, you have 50%. And so on. You can see you're never going to get to 100%. At 3,000, you don't even have 80%. And the formula is exactly like this. It's your damage multiplied by this. And again, for each of the different counter stats, that's just going to be slightly different with regards to the input there. But the actual formula stays the same. And it's only different then for your damage buffs, which is a simple multiplier, which ends up then with a linear gain. So the more you have of it, the more effective it is. And there's no, say, real diminishing returns. Again, the formula is super simple. It's your damage multiplied by the gain. You have to add +1 to make it a multiplier. Otherwise, it would just be reducing your damage. And that is ultimately the damage calculator. mainly dedicated for PvE, because when you look at PvP, there are some more calculations you need to do, like endurance versus crit chance. If the enemy has more endurance than your crit chance, you have the chance to do minimum damage. You also have block chance if you're against a sword and shield user, and you also have your CC skills. However, keep in mind, PvE enemies do have certain defenses, like they have a direct defense stat. We have that too here from gear. And that means you're just going to flat out deal less damage against PvE enemies versus a dummy, which has none of those stats. So if you can gain in any way the ability to shred enemy defense, like Destructive Fang, that is huge value. However, reducing the enemy's defense below 0 has no effect. So if you use it on a dummy, you won't see any gain. We can test this here. Island of Terror, level 50 enemy. This guy's gonna have defense. We cast our fireball, and we can see we get a hit of 27,442. This damage hit does match what we get with the calculator, give or to a few digits, and is indeed a pretty substantial damage loss compared to if they did not have defense. Some enemies do have endurance. A good example is Rancorwood. It specifically states it here, all endurance increased. This means this guy has extra endurance. Unfortunately, we don't know how much. You can test it. It's very tedious though. You essentially need to hit the guy 100 times, track each of the hits, find out how many of them are crits, calculate that based on your crit chance, your expected amount. Say if I have 1,000 crit hit chance, I should be critting 50% of the time. And if, say, this guy had 500 endurance, I would only critically hit him for 33% of the time instead. And that way you could find out exactly how much endurance he has. I don't really want to go through that because ultimately it's not really going to affect how you want to build your character, as he's not going to be the only enemy you're facing. You have to face all these other guys and say they don't have those boosts, say, to endurance. In the Isle of Terror, he also has endurance, and so do like all the mobs. I can enter here to show you. When you target them, you can see he has all endurance. So this mob has extra endurance defense. It's going to be harder to critically hit against them. It's going to be useful to have endurance shred abilities. Again, by how much, we don't know. If you find out, be sure to share it. That would be awesome. And again, you can technically test it. It's just very tedious. Some enemies do have evasion, particularly when it states it, like some say they have endurance, and so you may notice you're missing your attacks against them. Some people have said they do not have evasion at all, so hit is useless. Haven't really found that to be the case. Certain enemies do have evasion. It needs more thorough testing, but your basic attacks seem to miss a bit more than what they should. So it leads some people to say that your skills can't miss, but your basic attacks can. If I go in Gate of Infinity here and just basic attack, if we ever see a miss, like we just see there, that means this guy does have evasion versus my basic attacks. So there is something going on there that we aren't fully aware of. I have ran content with, say, just 100 hit chance, and you can clearly see some attacks missing. Say I'm with a crossbow here, 50 hit chance. People claim these monsters do not have any evasion, then I shouldn't see any misses here. But look how many misses there are. And this guy even has damage resistance. I don't do any damage. So this guy clearly has a certain level of evasion, as he can, yes, clearly miss those skills. I'm using quickfire. My auto attacks will show up as like grey. Skill attacks are orange there. You see the orange misses. So people going around and saying PvE enemies have no evasion is nonsense. You need a certain amount of hit. I now have 605 hit, and I should barely see any misses, if at all, using these abilities. You see, we could still see the occasional miss. So even this much is not enough against this monster. Again, those are skill misses, not auto attack misses. You can determine again how much you need based on just testing. You keep increasing it by a little bit until a certain point where you do not see a single skill miss, again based on the orange numbers. Ultimately, I hope this helps, just to give you some insights and the ability to compare your damage output. When you're looking at getting gear upgrades, make sure to find out if that's actually going to improve your damage. However, this does not account for all your stats, and for that, you're going to have to look at the exact abilities you're using, how often you're using them, and thus take into account your attack speed, buff duration, even in this case mana regen for extra chance for mana ball eruption, which boosts your damage, and these can ultimately play a pretty big role. The more often you can cast your abilities, the more damage you're going to output, versus just improving, say, your maximum damage by a little bit more. Keep in mind also some abilities are calculated a little bit differently, especially damage over time. It does not take your maximum damage on critical hits. When you use the calculator to figure out how much damage your damage over times are actually doing and what boosts them, you're going to need to remove your crit hit chance and your heavy attack chance here. Look at all of your stats, figure out all of the bonuses that give you boosts to damage over time, input them into the calculator, again avoiding crit hit chance and heavy attack chance. You see this number then here, the average total damage is going to be your non-crit damage over time hits. You see that on this dummy just here. 389 is about what we're calculating. However, be aware that your heavy attack damage over times will be double that value, and then your critical damage over times, like this as you see here, is simply multiplied and gain the boost through your critical damage. So it doesn't really align with the math here, but with this full breakdown it is taken into consideration, and you can see the damage over time formula that's using the same formula as the calculator, just with that tweak to take into account the difference in how it uses the base damage, crit and heavies. Curse Explosion as well. This is very misconceived. It has its initial hit, which is calculated normally, but the follow-up hit is calculated based on the damage over times will do with the remaining duration. I have tested this thoroughly and double-checked values in-game, and it all checks out. When you apply a damage over time, you look at the remaining duration, and then when you cast Curse Explosion, it's going to deal its normal damage per hit, but then the follow-up hit is based on how much damage over time that damage over time ability will deal over the remaining duration. So if it has, say, we cast it now, 15 seconds left, your Curse Explosion will deal all that damage that it would have dealt over those 16 seconds or those 15 seconds instantly in its burst, and it will do half as much if you have the spec, but if you don't have the spec it will remove that damage over time. So in PvE it's generally best to have the spec so it doesn't remove the damage over time and you gain the damage boost of the damage over time, but then half as much of that damage over time again with the explosion. But that's ultimately it. It gets a bit intricate, and yes, you need to make a full breakdown of your entire rotation, abilities, their cooldowns, and all those stats you have if you want to min-max your analysis. But on a base level, this can still help a ton. It just does not, again, account for cooldown, attack speed, buff duration, which can still be very important stats. If I'm to give you a bit of a guide on, say, what stats you generally want to reach and achieve on your PvE build, it would ultimately as much dex and then wisdom as possible, followed by perception or strength. For any class which uses a lot of buff abilities, particularly Invocator or Dark Blighter, you're using these where the buff duration on those matters, then perception's more your priority. Of course, don't end up dying because you don't have hit points that strength would otherwise give. In terms of hit chance, I'm not too sure, but you want to at least have 400 to 600. It's going to depend what enemies you're facing, and it ultimately needs more analysis, but this seems to be doing me fine. Critical hit chance, you want to get about 1500. Not much point any more than that. And then for heavy attack, you also ideally want to be getting 800 to 1000 when you include your boss heavy attack. You mainly get boss heavy attack through runes. Skill damage boost, you want to prioritize this above crit and heavy, particularly on weapons with those runes. For bonus damage, just forget about it. Critical damage, you want to get as much as you can. Buff duration, again, is dependent on what build you're running, but it can be very important, and just get as much as you can on your rings, your necklace, and then some armor pieces will have it too. And otherwise, species damage. much like skill damage boost, but because you have less of it, is more impactful. Get as much as you can through having particular weapons and having food whenever you go against certain enemy types. Use it for an extra 50. In terms of cooldown speed and attack speed, I generally recommend trying to get at least 50% of both. If you're a wand user with Curse Explosion, getting the damage over time sets, either the Sacred or the Chosen, is best combined with the critical damage set. And then prioritize getting as much damage over your time through certain bonuses and masteries. Again, you need to use like a calculator when you're looking at certain amounts. Do I gain 100 crit hit chance, or do I gain like 10 more skill damage boost? It will be dependent on how much you already have of either stat and how much it actually benefits you. You have to use a calculator like this in order to figure that out. So again, thanks all for watching. Hopefully this helps, and we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.